If you stand near Presidio, Texas, and look across the Rio Grande towards Ojinaga, Mexico, you're looking at a border. At least that's what the maps tell us. There's Texas is on one side, Chihuahua, Mexico on the other. The United States here, Mexico there. But if you could stand in that same place 500 years ago, none of those things existed. There wasn't Texas. There wasn't a Mexico. There wasn't a United States. There wasn't even a border. What you would have seen instead was one of the most important human crossroads in this part of North America, a place where two rivers came together and where people had already been coming, well, they've been coming together for centuries. I'm Hank Wilson. Welcome to the Hidden History of Texas. And today we're going to La Junta de los Ríos, the meeting of the rivers. Geography explains why people came here. We're in the Chihuahuan Desert, a country where water determines almost everything. But near present-day Presidio and Ojinaga, the Rio Conchos flows northward out of Mexico and joins the Rio Grande. Now, around that junction lies a broad ribbon of fertile floodplains surrounded by desert and mountains. It's an oasis. And people recognized its value a very long time before Europeans arrived. Archaeologists have found evidence of human occupation in the region stretching back thousands of years. By around the year 1200, if not earlier, people were living in established villages along the rivers. They farmed, they hunted, they gathered wild plants, they made pottery, and they traded. La Junta wasn't some isolated little settlement sitting alone in the desert. It was connected to a much larger world. Trade and cultural influences linked the people here with communities towards Casas Grandes in Chihuahua, the Pueblo world further north and west, the Buffalo Plains to the northeast, and eventually communities extending deep into what we now call Texas. Archaeologists have even found pieces of East Texas Caddoan pottery at La Junta. Now think about that distance for a moment. Long before highways, railroads, or maps showing Texas as a single political entity, goods and presumably the people carrying them were moving across enormous distances. La Junta was part of that network. And this is where we meet one of the most interesting and frustrating people in early Texas history, the Humano, Jumano. So we're going to call it Jumano. I know we say it's La Junta, so we can call it the Humano. Except there's a problem. We're not exactly sure who they were. That's not because nobody wrote about them. The Spanish certainly did. The problem is that Spanish explorers, missionaries, and officials used names for indigenous peoples according to their own understanding. Sometimes a name described how people looked, sometimes where they lived, sometimes what other indigenous groups called them. Now, sometimes the Spanish apparently invented the name themselves, and sometimes the same name seems to have been applied to different groups. That makes the word humano considerably more complicated than it first appears. The earliest known Spanish use of the name dates back to the late 16th century. Over the following century, Spaniards described people they called humanos across a huge geographical area, from northern Mexico and the Rio Grande into West Texas, the Pecos country, the southern plains, and as far east as the Caddo communities. These people were widely known as traders and travelers. Now, some Spanish observers called them rayados, the striped people, because of distinctive lines or markings on their faces. They hunted buffalo. They carried goods between communities separated by hundreds of miles. And they became important intermediaries between very different indigenous worlds. But were the farmers living permanently at La Junta also Jumano? Well, for a long time, many historians said yes. Archaeologist J. Charles Kelly, whose work dominates most of what we know about La Junta, proposed that there were essentially two related ways of life. One group farmed in permanent settlements at La Junta and became known in Spanish records as patarribes, Another lived a more mobile life, hunting buffalo and trading across the plains. Those were the people more commonly called Jumano. Now, under that interpretation, they were branches of the same larger people, but some scholars have questioned that. The written accounts from Spanish expedition describe different communities at La Junta speaking different languages. Some historians now believe the farming peoples of La Junta and the mobile Jumano may have been distinct peoples who developed a close economic relationship. The farmers had corn and other agricultural products. The hunters and traders had buffalo products and access to enormous trading networks. Each had something the other needed, which means the relationship may have been less about belonging to one tribe and more about two communities helping each other survive. And here's something else worth remembering. Patarebwe wasn't necessarily what anybody at La Junta called themselves. It appears to have been a Spanish label, probably an insulting one. So when we say any of the other names found in Spanish documents, we need to understand what we're actually reading. We are reading and we are seeing indigenous America through somebody else's notebook. And the people holding the notebook and writing in the notebook were newcomers. Those newcomers first appeared at La Junta in 1535. 4 exhausted travelers arrived after one of the strangest journeys in the history of North America. Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, Andrés Dorantes, Alonso del Castillo, and an African man known to history as Estebanico. They were survivors of the disastrous Narvaez expedition. Years earlier, they had landed in Florida. Then everything went wrong. Shipwreck, disease, hunger, captivity, and years of wandering eventually brought the 4 survivors across what is now Texas into northern Mexico. When they reached La Junta, they encountered something different from much of what they had seen during their journey. Villages, agriculture, permanent housing, a densely settled river valley. Cabeza de Vaca and his companions referred to some of the people they met as people of the cows because buffalo hides were so important in their lives. Many of the residents were actually away hunting buffalo when the travelers arrived, and that little detail tells us something important. The categories we like to create, farmer, hunter, settled village, nomadic people, weren't always rigid. People moved, they traded, they hunted seasonally, they married across communities. Their world was more complicated than the boxes later historians put around them. Cabeza de Vaca eventually left. And that is where I want to reverse the way we usually tell this story. In most history, Cabeza de Vaca arrives, encounters the Indians, and continues his journey. But imagine that moment from La Junta. 4 strange men arrive. They're fed. They're sheltered. They're given information. Then they leave. And life continues. Cabeza de Vaca's arrival wasn't the beginning of La Junta's history. It was an event in a history that was already centuries old. Many Spaniards followed. 1581, 1582, expeditions passed through the region and left more detailed descriptions. They found large population living in communities along the rivers. One Spanish estimate put the population at more than 10,000 people, although, like many early population estimates, we should kind of treat that number cautiously. The important point isn't the exact number. It's that this was clearly a substantial human landscape. The Spanish weren't wandering through empty country. They were traveling through somebody else's homeland, and they recognized La Junta's strategic importance immediately. Water, food, trade routes, people. From La Junta, you could move north towards the Pueblo settlements, east towards the plains, south into Nueva Vizcaya, and follow the rivers through the desert. Everyone understood the value of the place. The Spanish simply weren't the first to understand it. By the 17th century, the balance of power was changing. Apache groups were expanding southward and westward into the plains. The introduction of horses transformed warfare, hunting, travel, and trade. Pressure increased on Jumano communities and their allies. And that brings us to one of the more remarkable figures in early Texas history, Juan Sabatea. Now, Sabiata, S-A-B-E-A-T-A, Sabiata, was a Jumano leader and diplomat who understood something about the Spanish. He understood what they wanted to hear. In 1683, he traveled to El Paso seeking Spanish assistance. He wanted allies against Apache expansion, and he also wanted missions established among his people. Now, according to the story he told Spanish authorities, indigenous peoples had witnessed a miraculous cross appearing in the sky or on a mountainside. That got their attention. Now, whether he believed the story, embellished it, or simply understood Spanish religious psychology better than the Spanish understood Jumano politics is something we'll never know. But it worked. Missionaries and soldiers headed towards La Junta, and the Jumano had already begun constructing churches when they arrived. That's diplomacy. Saviato wasn't simply reacting to European colonization. He was attempting to use Spanish power for Jumano purposes. It didn't ultimately work. Spanish-Jumano relations, they deteriorated. Mission efforts repeatedly failed. Indigenous communities resisted Spanish authority. Slave raiding devastated parts of the region. Apache pressure continued. Now later, the Comanche would transform the balance of power on the southern plains even further, and little by little, the indigenous political world described by the earliest Spanish visitors changed. Some communities disappeared from the written record. Some migrated. Some joined other peoples. Some were absorbed into the growing mixed population of northern Mexico, and some almost certainly remained exactly where their ancestors had lived, even though the names Spanish officials used to describe them disappeared. Which brings us back to the word Jumano. For generations, historians tried to find the Jumanos. Where'd they go? What tribe did they become? Were they absorbed by the Apache, the Wichita, the Caddo? Did descendants remain at La Junta? There have been many theories, but perhaps the question itself reveals something about how history has traditionally been written. We expect people to fit neatly into names, one tribe, one territory, one language, one identity, and human beings have almost never behaved that neatly, especially people living at a crossroads. La Junta connected farmers and hunters, desert people and plains people, Pueblo communities in eastern Texas. Later it connected Spanish, indigenous, Mexican, and American worlds. People traded there. People migrated there. People married there. Cultures blended here. Identities changed here. And eventually governments drew a line through the middle of it. Now, after Mexican independence in 1821, La Junta became a part of Mexico's northern frontier. Then came Texas independence, war between Mexico and the United States, and finally an international boundary along the Rio Grande. Suddenly a river that helped connect communities became the line separating two countries. Presidio developed on one side, Ojinaga on the other. But people living there didn't suddenly forget that the communities across the river had been connected for generations. Families continued crossing, trade continued, culture continued, the border was new, La Junta was old, very old. And maybe that's the part of this story worth remembering. When we study the early history of Texas, we have a habit of beginning when Europeans arrived. Cabeza de Vaca came here. Coronado explored here. The Spanish established a mission. A Presidio was built. But those are beginnings only if we're telling the story of Europeans. For the people already living at La Junta, they were simply another series of arrivals. Important arrivals. Ultimately devastating arrivals in many ways, but arrivals nonetheless. The rivers were already here. The farms were already here. The trade networks were already here. And generations of people had already looked across the landscape and called it home. We may never know exactly what all of them called themselves. Jumano is one of the names history has handed down to us. Patarabue is another, but those names came largely through Spanish ears and Spanish pens. The people themselves were more complicated than the labels. History usually is. Today, stand near Presidio, look across the Rio Grande, and you'll see Mexico. Stand in Ojinaga, look north, you'll see the United States. But stand there long enough. Think back far enough. Maybe you'll see something else. Two rivers, a fertile valley, villages, farmers, hunters, traders, families. People coming and going across a landscape where no international boundary existed. Long before there was a Texas, long before there was a Mexico, long before anybody drew a line down the river, there was La Junta. And the rivers are still there. I'm Hank Wilson, and this has been The Hidden History of Texas.